It was a huge, devastating flood that caused the deaths of hundreds of people in Europe, notably the Netherlands, as well as in neighbouring Belgium and in the UK as well. A gigantic storm 70 years ago, right at the point of the high spring tide, caused dramatic water surges. Sea defences just swept away, simply overwhelmed, resulting in terrible flooding. Well, whilst more than 300 people died in the UK, more than 1,800 lost their lives in the Netherlands. The water Noodstram came on the night of the 1st of February, around 3 a.m, as many dykes across the region of Zeeland proved just unable to resist the onslaught. At the time, around a fifth of the land of the Netherlands was below sea level, the water simply crashing in, wiping out 200,000 hectares of land. Well, since the disaster, the so-called Delta Plan has seen millions spent upgrading sea defences, already over 500 kilometres of protection, and today the updated plans look ahead to what might be to come up until the year 2050. But with the dire warnings about climate change and ongoing rising sea levels, and as well the risk of increased dramatic weather events also due to climate change, well, could any defences ever be enough? For many of the last survivors of what happened, their lives remain dominated by the events of 70 years ago. Well, Alix Le Bourdon and Ferdinand van Tetz revisit the Zeeland disaster for France 24.
Water. Waar kwam dat nou vandaan? Hij keek in het rond en zag een kleine opening in de dijk, waar een dun straaltje water doorstroomde. Ieder kind in Holland zou rillen bij de gedachte aan een lek in de dijk. In een flits begreep hij wat hem te doen stond. Hij duwde zijn vinger erin om het gat dicht te houden. De straal was gestopt.
The story of Hans Brinker is well known in the Netherlands. But 70 years ago, not even the courage of this little boy would have been enough to save the low-lying coastal land from the water. On the 1st of February 1953, the largest flood in Dutch history hit Zeeland. Thousands of houses were swept away, almost 2,000 people drowned. Jaap survived, but has never forgotten that dramatic winter day.
Daar kwamen de golven dus harder op de dijk.
That's where the waves were strongest, and that's where the dike broke, because there was more and more water in the polder, which in the end was totally submerged. Life in a polder behind a sea dike is always connected to the sea. You live with it, you plan accordingly. You always know when the high tide is, when it's dangerous. People in 1953 were quite prepared for this, but not that the water would come this high. High water happened often, but never as high as 1953.
At the time, Jaap lived on this farm just a few dozen meters behind the dike. When he got up in the morning that day, its protection had already been breached during the night. From the window of the attic where he was hiding with his brothers and sisters, he saw water as far as the eye could see. But it was the combination of a large storm on the North Sea and the high tide which led to disaster.
Mijn vader heeft 's morgens, toen wij daar kwamen.
My father told us in the morning that the water wouldn't come higher than in 1943 when the Germans flooded the polders. But in the afternoon, the high tide comes twice a day. The next high tide came in and added 3.5 meters of water on top. We were sitting upstairs in the attic. And outside, we first heard the cows walk around, then we heard them swim, and then there was silence, because they had all drowned.
He has never forgotten the fear he felt during the hours they waited for help. His parents survived, but Jaap lost many relatives in the disaster.
This is my aunt with my cousin and her husband. All three of them drowned. My grandmother, like my cousin, was never found. Of the 1,800 victims of the flood, 104 people were never found. Some people were found, but were unrecognizable.
Beyond this personal tragedy, the flood left an entire region traumatized. In the cemetery of Stavenis, a large number of gravestones bear the date February 1st, 1953. Other tombs remain anonymous.
Here,
someone was found, but there's no name.
70 years later, Jaap comes here regularly to pay tribute.
We're here
in front of the grave of my grandfather, who died in a car crash in November 1946. And here is the commemorative tombstone of my grandmother, because she was never found. It's only in remembrance.
To honor the victims, there is one right which Jaap never fails to exercise. Every 4 years, he votes for the Water Board. The 21 offices across the Netherlands are responsible for the upkeep of the dikes. In 1953, the whole country was preoccupied with post-war reconstruction. As a result, maintenance of the dikes had taken a back seat. An engineer at the time warned they were in a poor state.
He submitted his last report a week before the flood disaster. He warned that if the water got extremely high, 60 to 90 centimeters of water would flood over the dikes.
But the Dutch learned their lesson from the disaster. The plans proposed by this visionary engineer ended up being the Delta Works. Instead of protecting the land by raising or expanding the dikes, the idea was to close off the estuaries. Over 30 years, 8 huge barriers were constructed to protect Zeeland. The largest is here, at the entrance to the Eastern Scheldt. When the water level is expected to rise 3 meters, the storm surge barrier is shut.
Once the decision has been taken to close the barrier, we go to the control panel and press the button. We do that roughly 4 hours before the dangerous water level is reached.
Since the barrier was built, it's been fully deployed 28 times. The Dutch authorities are keeping an eye on that number. Based on current predictions, the barrier will keep the country safe until at least the end of the century.
The sea level rises 2.9 millimeters a year right now, but there are scenarios in which it rises much faster. And so, of course, we have started to think about this question. Okay, what will we do then?
All scenarios are being considered. The worst case envisions the polar ice caps completely melting, resulting in a 10-meter rise in sea level. On top of these barriers, the dikes have been rigorously strengthened since the flood of 1953.
The land sinks a little over time, and the sea level is slowly rising. So it's increasingly important to have good dikes. If we didn't have dikes, 60% of the Netherlands could flood.
Special attention is being paid to this dike. The Water Board wants to raise and enlarge it by more than 3 meters.
This dike needs to become much stronger, especially because the consequences here would be enormous if the dike breaks. Within 3 hours, there would probably be 5 meters of water. 1,800 lives would be at serious risk, and they wouldn't have time to flee because all the highways would be underwater.
To tackle the threat posed by rising sea levels in the Netherlands, these engineers are starting to think outside of the box.
For current dike reinforcements, we take into account rising sea levels over the next 50 years. Eventually, we'll have to think beyond that, how to reinforce them in the future. For example, will we be able to reinforce them in the same way, or do we maybe need to build islands in front of the coast?
This museum, dedicated to the 1953 flood, explores ways to tackle the threat posed by water, both in the past and the future. We meet Jaap, who was the director here for many years. He's close to 80 now, but has still come today to pass on his story to a new generation.
When we woke up on Sunday morning, the farm was still on a dry island, but the water came everywhere, over there, everywhere.
My grandmother also survived. She was only a baby at the time. How old were you then?
I was 9 years old. There's the Eastern Scheldt barrier. There was a fishing boat. They took us to Rotterdam, to my aunt's.
Fleur is particularly interested in Jaap's story because of her grandmother. But the young girl also wants to learn from the past to prepare for the future.
We have to take care of the environment because if the ice on the North and South Pole melts, the Netherlands could be hit by a huge flood like this again. Because the Netherlands is very low and that's dangerous.
I'm not afraid of that. Right now, everything is very modern, and the dikes are much stronger than before. The dunes and the beach are also much stronger, so I'm not afraid.
This concern has led to a growing number of young Dutch people visiting this museum, like Sal, a young environmental activist.
Hello.
Two different generations, but also two different views on how to keep the country safe.
I don't see leaders appear who are really going to take the country in a different direction. And we can endlessly try and raise dikes and such, but at some point that will no longer be enough.
I truly believe that with time there will be solutions, and that at some point there will be people who truly have a vision who can look a bit beyond. I also think there'll be more and more technological capabilities.
We should also tell politicians that we want things to be done differently. We need you to act, because the politicians are the ones who take decisions. As an individual you can do your bit, but there needs to be a change within society, and that's something I also protest for in the streets.
To make this change happen, Sal regularly participates in environmental protests. Tonight, he is gathered in front of the only nuclear power station in the Netherlands to commemorate the anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, and above all, to demand a faster transition to renewable energy. Protest is still the only way for Sal to express the anger of his generation, who he feels are faced with political decision-makers who aren't doing enough.
Seriously, allow the Dutch people to have a say. Besides anger, there is also a kind of frustration, the feeling that we are not being taken seriously, and that is something that I see among a lot of my generation. In the case of climate change, we always opt for short-term solutions, and those who should be thinking seriously long-term, they don't.
These activists are not the only ones worried about climate change. The farmers of Zeeland are too. Hendrik Jan is dealing with a troubling phenomenon. With the rise in sea level, the farmland becomes more and more saline.
And that's why, in very dry periods, our crops encounter salinization. The salt causes the crops to stop growing, and in the worst case, they die.
The salination is exacerbated by the drought, which gets worse every year. This farmer fears that this land will one day be unfarmable.
10 years ago, I started discussions with the water board to see how they can get the sweet water here into our ditches. And the measure they took is that they constructed this ditch 4 years ago to transport the sweet water across the island, because we are in the middle of an island here.
In freshwater distribution, priority is given to the Dutch dykes, especially the oldest ones, which could crack if the peat soil gets too dry. First come the dykes, only then the provision of drinking water to households, leaving Sal with the question just how far the country will go to protect itself from the water.
And if climate change keeps going and the sea level rises, which we assume it will in the next tens and hundreds of years, and if the storms get worse, which we now also see, then I'm afraid whether we will be able to keep living here, because we cannot have an endless fight against the water.
It's a heartbreaking thought for this young Zeelander who loves his area. These lands, which one day might be reclaimed by the sea.
Alix Le Bourdon and Ferdinand Vantes revisiting the Zeeland disaster for France 24. Well, that's all from this week's edition. You can catch it and all the previous editions as well on our website at france24.com. Thanks very much for watching. More news coming up for you very shortly.